Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Photography Department of the Art Institute of Pittsburgh's online program. We have a very special guest with us tonight. Larry Volk is going to talk to us. He's an artist, educator, lecturer, and author. He's a professor of photography at the School of Visual and Performing Arts at Endicott University, and he has an MFA in photography from the Rhode Island School of Design. Larry is the co-author of Danielle Currier of No Plastic Sleeves, the Portfolio and Self-Promotion Guide for Photographers and Designers. This was published by Focal Press, which was released in its second edition in 2014. Focal Press also has an offer for you guys that you can take advantage of if you'd like. There's a 20% discount on any of their books, and I will post that information for you momentarily in the chat section. And Larry has a lot of great experience. He works in documentary photography, location lighting and production, video, time-based production, photographic artist books, digital image editing and production, and fine digital printing. And he's an accomplished artist, and his work has been exhibited nationally, and it is held in both private and museum collections. So Larry, we're delighted to have you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thanks for that really nice introduction. And I'm really pleased, to be here and be talking to you tonight. I want to thank you and the Art Institute for inviting me. Let's get on with the discussion. Mary, you're seeing the right screen. There should be a No Plastic Sleeves book in your view. Is that correct?
Let me see. Yes, I see that.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure you're seeing the screen that I'm seeing. So let's get started, and before I begin, I want to just acknowledge the contributions of my co-author, Danielle Currier. What you're looking at is a screenshot from her blog site, noplasticsleeves.com, which is a site she developed as an offshoot of our book, and it's really something that she put together on her own, and it's really grown, and I want to both acknowledge that we'll be using some references from this and imagery from sample work, and also I highly recommend, if you haven't taken a look at this site, it's a great resource. It has a worldwide following. At one point there were at least 3,000 unique hits a week viewing this site, and photographers from all over the world submit, as well as designers submit portfolio and self-promotion pieces to her. She does a great job curating it, and there are also resources and links that are come from our book. We use it as an offshoot of our book to expand and update the content. So we'll be looking at some, as I said, some examples from that, but I just want to point you to that as well as you get working on your own portfolios in the future. So I want to begin by just sort of talking a little bit about the idea of what constitutes a portfolio. And since we first published our book in 2010, that's even evolved significantly. But what hasn't changed is the idea that the portfolio is more than just a container or vehicle to present your work. We view the portfolio as a creative statement, but really a comprehensive package that is evidence of your, as we say in the book, experience, knowledge, skills, creativity, innovation, your aesthetic and technical capabilities. And one of the keys is that it has a consistent message, not simply about the work you make, but who you are as a visual creative. And so as we start talking about portfolio tonight, we're going to be looking at some key components, which are the portfolio book, your web or online portfolio, promotional materials, a blog, and social media. I have to acknowledge that there's a lot of material to cover here, and so this is really going to be an overview, and I'm going to touch on a few key ideas that hopefully give you a good sense of how to approach portfolio and the portfolio package. So one of the things that we want to talk about is how do you start developing a portfolio, and typically photographers often start with their work, which makes sense because that's really the basis for your portfolio, but it's also important to look at yourself. And so when I have this idea of the process of portfolio development, the first step is really the development of visual identity, and a visual identity or even a brand kind of comes from looking at who you are, what you have to offer, and where you're going. And then from there, we develop and create a portfolio book and create the online portfolio and the successive materials. But initially, we start with assessing yourself, who you are, where you're going, what are your goals, and that leads to an idea that we refer to it as brand or branding. At large, you may not necessarily be getting into brand development for your own business or your own work as a photographer, but brand is sort of a basic idea, and as my colleague Danielle Currier describes it, brand is a touch point, a position. It contains personality, tone, message, and by defining yourself and creating some sense of a brand, which gets expressed through a visual design or a visual concept, you create a context for your work. And that, again, moves beyond simply a sampling of your skills and capabilities to a larger idea of what you bring to the table as a creative and what you're capable of. And brand is often encompassed in a brand identity system, and often that involves a brand mark. And the intention of a brand identity system or mark is to create a concise and effective visual, which expresses the essence of who you are and what you have to offer. So as it says on my slide, it's a distinct mark. It can have a color palette, as Danielle's described, 1 to 2 selected typefaces, and it's a distillation. It functions symbolically, and brand marks are very sophisticated. They often are more than just letter forms, and as sometimes we talk about, often letter forms or initials kind of come off as monograms. So not truly brand marks. They take a lot of development, and a very good brand identity should be, as we define in the book, distinctive. It allows you to stand out from your competition. Authentic in the sense that it's relevant and meaningful to you in terms of what it communicates. It really suggests something clear about you. Memorable in that it consistently reinforces an idea and message about who you are, and versatile in that you can apply it in different settings for different materials. It creates a very clear and palpable communication of who you are. Well, one of the problems is how do you get to this? And I have to say that, again, for someone starting out, maybe you're not going to develop a brand, but the process of thinking about, well, who you are and what your brand might be is a way to develop a visual identity, which is something you can do and bring to a portfolio. So one of the things that we talk about is assessing your work and interests, and then assessing yourself. Where are you trying to get to? Who's your audience? What's the market you wish to target? What kind of specialization do you have? Do you have a visual style or visual approach? And while your work is the focal point here, you also want to be thinking about yourself, as I said earlier, and this is intended to lead to a self-description. You're trying to characterize who you are, what you have to offer, and what you create. And that can lead to a brand. And one of the ways to do that is to develop what we call a brand statement. And this is a really good exercise because as you verbalize a brand statement, you're formulating a description of yourself. And the more condensed it is, the better it can be. And that verbalization can be using adjectives that characterize who you are, sort of attributes that we've talked about in our book, about attributes like witty, playful, bold, dynamic, adventurous, modern, abstract, edgy, sophisticated, elegant. You're trying to find a language to talk about yourself. And there are other ways to do this. You can try and construct a self-portrait, even use images. Designers sometimes use mood boards. You can even try and develop a small promo piece. Sometimes we talk about working with someone who you would consider hiring to design something for you and trying to give them a self-description about what you need. So as we talk about this, you may use this brand exploration to really develop a brand concept or a visual approach that then creates a look and feel for your portfolio. So as I've said earlier, if you're just entering the business, developing a brand may not really be appropriate. It's a very complex and encompassing process. However, if you formulate ideas about yourself as a brand, you can develop a visual identity, this look and feel. And that can translate into, the brand can be translated in some visual elements that express aspects of you and your work and your approach. Some of those things can be color palette, typeface, maybe a visual reference or stylistic element. And that's really what we're talking about here, particularly for people kind of new to the photographic market. Just to provide you with some sort of typical references, this is a sort of typical set of materials with a logo and a color system. This is from the No Plastic Sleeves blog for a photographer named Dan Bannister. And here you have a brand mark or logo applied to a variety of materials. There's a color scheme, and you see its application in business cards and collateral materials and postcards. And so this is kind of what we'd often talk about, a brand identity approach or brand identity system. To give you a little bit more of an idea, here's a really elegant and sophisticated logo developed by Danielle Currier from the blog again for a client, Jacob Bodkin. And he was an Austin, Texas-based adventure photographer who wanted to go with a typographic treatment, and he wanted something that had a bit of an edge, maybe slightly modern and cool, as Danielle describes in her blog. And she modified a typeface and brought in a graphical element and really transformed the letter form, a J, into an abstract reference to movement through water and air, which seemed to be relevant to the kind of work he did. And just to show you how this then gets applied, here it shows up in a couple forms on his website. And so these types of logos require a bit of development. But the important thing is to start thinking about the visual character that you might bring to it. Another aspect of this is to look at how a visual identity or even a brand or brand mark, if taken further, is implemented and used within materials. So this is a photographer, Marcus Smith. He's featured in our book. And here you have this sort of woven logo. It's a kind of, from what he describes, a combination of the letters M and S. And you find it on his portfolio cover, and then here it is reappearing on his online portfolio site in a tablet presentation as well as a mobile presentation, and then further in his business cards. And so the most important thing here is the consistent presentation throughout all the materials that gives him a very professional look. It's very complete and consistent. Another example is photographer Luke Copping. Here's his letterpress business card with this debossed pattern of kind of a cross-shaped form. It's a very discreet and spare presentation. You see it then presented in his blog and repeated there with also this minimal color palette, very spare. And you see it again in his portfolio book. So these are examples of kind of a consistency of approach, which is something that you really want in a portfolio package. Just a few other kinds of sort of visual characteristics or brands that others have used. We have this in our book. This is Betty Hatchett, and it's a really nice little bit of play on her name with the hatchet forming around this sort of longhand approach and slightly stylized logo. Matt Barnes, you have a kind of black letter B, and then the sort of sans serif typeface that's kind of an interesting hybrid, the devil and angel on his shoulder, and then the sort of slight reference to, for those of you who are old enough, an Elvis Costello album, which kind of represents music and a little bit of an edgy sort of pop culture reference. Here, finally, a couple final examples that I want to show you that really are probably most useful to students who are starting to develop their portfolios, where you can create brand identification without an entire brand identity system. So this is an example from our book. This is a food photographer, Rena Newman. It's a great example where you have a cover that uses a checkered fabric that references a tablecloth or maybe a picnic blanket. So there's this iconography that the material brings. It's sort of playful and dynamic. And then it's a great lead into the interior of the book, which then has photographs of her food. So here's an example where you don't necessarily have a logo type. You do have a little bit of a logo here if we toggle back, but really it's the material that sets up the reading of this book. And that's an approach that many of you can take. You don't have to develop necessarily a logo to have visual references and a way to create a visual identity that starts to talk about you and your work and creates a reading. Another example is photographer Roger Snyder, whose portfolios contain custom big rig trucks, and so Roger had custom painted aluminum covers made. They're painted with the very same paints that are used by custom car and truck painters, and this creates a really nice association and lead into the content of his books, which are these photographs of these trucks. So if we start to talk about the portfolio book, we're going to look at a few aspects of it, and we're going to start with the book forms. And portfolio books do not have to have complicated forms to be successful. This is a post and screw. These are simple board covers. The advantage of this kind of book form is that you can easily swap out the content of it. It's easy to make. It's inexpensive, even if you don't have a custom stamped cover. And this is really a nice simple form. We have another example from the No Plastic Sleeves blog of photographer Luis Azevedo, who creates a board cover here, and you have a post and screw form with a sort of stiff chipboard cover that's been scored and folded. And again, it's a nice simple form. In our book, we have an example from Xavier Wallach where you have just stiff cover stock that's been scored. You can kind of see a score line on the post to enable it to fold, and it's basically simply printed on his color inkjet printer using really simple tools, and you have a really nice clean presentation. So the forms do not have to be complicated. And finally, this is an example of actually a magazine format printed by MagCloud. This is Luke Copping. Again, you see the cross from his brand mark earlier, and this is just an example of a really nice way to produce a different kind of portfolio. And MagCloud happens to be relatively inexpensive. It can cost, for maybe 20 to 30 pages, about $15 to print a magazine format. So this is a really clean and easy way to make a book as well, and we'll get to that as we talk about printing on demand services. When we start talking about the portfolio book, we often start with cover design, and this is an example from a book of Karen Bonds. This is a really interesting polished feel. It's a kind of a laser cut aluminum. The reason we talk about cover design, because you have a lot more opportunity for free play. The interior pages of the book really need to feature your work and can't have too many competing elements, so the cover can be an expressive approach that can drive the visual identity of your portfolio and speak to the kind of work you're doing. So Karen Bond has this very slick and interesting cover and interesting type treatment. This is a set of portfolio books by photographer Terry Vine. They're very finely produced. They show great attention to detail and materials and evoke quality and delicacy, precision. They're quite beautiful. This is an old student portfolio by Aisling Mullen, and here you have a reference to 120 film cover paper, which is a nice kind of tie into the photographic work inside. In this example, this is the work of Shay Evans, and it's his portfolio and what he's made it out of. And this is again from the No Plastic Sleeves blog. He's made it out of old baking sheets, so you have this really rough-hewn, weathered portfolio. That is, it has an evocative reference to maybe some of the ways he likes to approach his food photography. Here you have the back of it. This is a handmade book that he fabricated, although he had, I think, the cutting done for him to create his name and the logotype. And then inside you sort of see some of the food photography that is presented in the book. So there's a lot of approaches to cover. But once you start to work out some cover concepts, the next step is to really talk about the content and editing of a book. And one of the main questions is how much work to show. And on average, you want to show about 20 images. The intention here is to show a really focused statement through your imagery. And you want to show your ability to produce a cohesive, tightly edited body of work. When we're talking about editing, online portfolios often can differ from books in that they allow you to show more work. But really in both cases, and we'll talk more about online, you don't want to show too much work because you risk losing your viewer's attention. And you're not trying to encompass the entirety of your work. You're trying to create a very particular statement with the book itself. Online work can be more expansive, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the keys to tying together the work in your edit is sequencing. And as it says here, the goal is to create a complex set of relationships between the photographs by working with multiple images. So you're not just trying to get people to read from image to image because the book is bound that way and the images are contiguous and adjacent to each other. You're actually trying to create a larger statement by threading them together. And this shows your ability to conceive of larger ideas as well and concepts if you can create a body work that's tied together. When you're sequencing, you're really trying to think about connecting images through formal elements, through line, color, visual weight, positive, negative space. So you actually enhance reading and what we would call movement. The idea is that you're moving from image to image because you find connections between them. I can't really provide you with a lengthy discussion about this, but just to show you a few examples, these are some photographs by photographer Lisa Kessler, who's done a body of work about the color pink and its both social and cultural significance. And so with this body of work, you have a lot of different approaches to this subject. And in this example, I've taken 3 images and worked them together, tied them formally by just the kind of horizontal line that runs through them. In this example, we have 3 different images that are really tied together by geometric forms: the square window frame, the more rectangular window, and the rectangular form of the table. In this example, I've actually looked at sort of the movement of bodies and literally the movement of arms and hands, and so you have kind of a progression of up, down, and down, and you have the repetition of sort of the physical form, the physical subjects in the photograph. And just to give you a little bit of a quick overview, here we tie together 3 clusters or 4 clusters of groups of 3 where I'm trying to find formal elements that either tie them together and create movement as well. The lower section of this, the last 6 images, I tried to use the moving from both a physical object to figurative elements and tie together the last 3 images that are all primarily figurative. And so this is a really quick example of just trying to create more connections between images by looking at formal elements as well as content. And so I wanted to give you just some ideas about how to approach sequencing. This is another large area that you can spend a lot of time with. But one of the things you should do is really get your images out of your computer, off the screen, print out small proof prints, put them on a wall or table, and really move them around physically. It's a much better way to really see the relationships. I often suggest working with images in small groups. Don't try and edit a whole body of work as a whole. Try and work with sections of it. And the one thing you can do is identify strong images and sort of build out from there, making small clusters as I did in the previous example. And this is something that you might want to look at. It takes a while to do this. You want to give yourself some time, come back to it, and try and look at the flow of the images as you look through them and see if there are places where you might get stuck or where you get sort of locked down on one image, and see if you can try and work to creating a really nice reading that continues to move you through a viewer through from image to image. A question often comes up about different bodies of work. What do you do if you have different types of work? You can put them together if you can try and unify them, because maybe there's some stylistic or aesthetic connections. But often in some markets, it's better to have separate bodies of work, and you might want to make separate portfolios that are targeted for a particular audience. When we talk about, when we talk about producing your portfolio, I just want to reference the 2 approaches. One is print-on-demand publishing, which is very popular now with publishers like Blurb. The advantage of this is that they have a really good professional quality. There's really nice finish and feel to the binding. The cost is relatively low. The disadvantages are that you're restricted often to their set formats, and higher quality often it can increase the price of the book greatly if you want better papers. They're really much more common now, so they have less individual character and can appear a little bit more generic. So on the other side of this, if you decide to bind your own book, you have more flexibility with formats and the scaling of the book, and you can try creative solutions. You have control over image quality because you're printing it yourself. They are relatively low cost, and they're easy to update if you use a particular binding, and that like a post and screw, and you can have a kind of unique character to your book. Sometimes the disadvantage can be they're too homegrown. They don't look polished enough, And just as in the case with print on demand, better materials often cost more, and they can be very time intensive. That being said, Blurb, A&I, Edition One Books, MagCloud, they're all very good publishers. MagCloud is primarily a perfect bound magazine format. They're really limited to that, but they're relatively inexpensive and very high quality. One of the things about these is that all these publishers have PDF to book workflows, which allow you to use InDesign or Photoshop and give you much more control over layout and typography and scaling of the page. They often use color management, which gives you a much more professional book because you're using professional tools as opposed to their proprietary software, which is often simpler to use but more limited. So consistency and quality can be an important factor here, particularly when all these book publishers use color management, which I highly recommend. So we're going to jump shift now to the online portfolio, and the truth is that this may be the first thing that someone sees of your work. Perhaps initially a promo, but they're going to see your portfolio online first, and often the book really ends up being the closer. So one of the things that I want to talk about with online portfolios are a few key ideas, and one of them is consistency of voice. So if you develop a visual approach or a visual identity or even a brand, you want to have consistency that needs to carry over in terms of colors, type, formatting from your book. It should be showing up in your online portfolio in particular, and that's often overlooked by people newer to, who are newer professionals and just starting to develop their materials. You want to carry over all those visual elements and any branding. So in the case of Betty Hatchett, who you saw earlier, if we go to her website, you see both her logo as well as sort of a visual character to her site, which is reinforced and consistent with what you find in her business card. Another example is Luke Copping, who you see again a slightly less presence of a low cross form, but a very kind of spare, clean visual style, which is consistent with the rest of his materials. Here you have a student portfolio by Andrew Johnson, who's an interactive designer, and he has this sort of this bold color field at the top, dark tone across the top of his book, and this letter form which referenced his brand, which was Etherpoint. And when you go to his online portfolio and his mobile site, you see the repetition of those elements and the same look and feel typographic treatment as well in the mobile and online portfolio. When we talk about the online portfolio, another element that is really important is web standards such as responsive design. This is a standard that generally most site building platforms support. However, you really want to check as you start to explore site building options. But it's really important that your site should be viewable on multiple platforms and devices. So from desktop to laptop to tablet to smartphone, you don't know how your work's going to be seen, and this is a standard that really is available, but you want to check to make sure it works well. And so in a few examples here, you have again Marcus Smith, and you see an example of his portfolio presented online on a desktop, in a tablet form, and then with a smartphone. Another example is Noah Webb, where you see the scaling and proportions changing through responsive coding, and his portfolio presents very well both on a desktop form and in a tablet. One thing I want to note is that with Noah Webb, and this is from our book, you also see a larger view of his imagery that's available through the site. And this is a real difference between an online portfolio versus an image sharing site or social media site that hosts images. You have control over the presentation of your work. And when you get them out of the composite view, you can really present the images in a much larger view, and they really present much better. And the presentation of images is the primary object of your site. So this is why you want to have a well-developed site that uses galleries and themes that enable you to create really clean, discrete presentations that are well structured. So that being said, a third point I want to make about online portfolios is that you really want to think hard and spend time editing and developing the galleries and content of the site, just as you would your book. You want to structure the presentation of your work and you want to have a sort of clear idea presented about who you are and the type of work you do by the way that you organize it. You know, your site is meant to be curated. So as we describe in the book, you want to organize and prioritize. Consider who you're trying to speak to, what your audience is for your site. Look for logical groupings. However, you can create groupings that are idiosyncratic or unique to you if it makes sense, and be creative about that. You want to have a concise, convincing, and clear presentation, which is something we talk about in our book about portfolio in general. So the groupings can relate to different typical types of photographic classifications: portraits, still life. You know, there are a number of ways to do it. However, you can be more creative. When you're thinking about the number of images on a site, a minimum of 7 images is a recommendation for a particular gallery, and probably a maximum of 20. You do want to think about the fact that if you have 40 to 60 images on a site, that's a lot of work to look at. So you want to pay attention to that maximum, because you don't want to lose the attention of your viewer. You don't want them to lose sight of who they're looking at and who you are if they look at too much work. Just as an aside, we have this in our first edition book as an example of moving beyond standard gallery naming conventions. And what's really nice here is that the galleries are described with adjectives. And this is just a nice example of finding another way to approach this. And this is someone, Emily Nathan's a lifestyle and portrait photographer, but this was a really interesting and continues to be, I think, an interesting approach to kind of break out of the standard box. It's not necessary to do this, but anything that adds a little more character to the site is something useful. So I just wanted to show you this one example. When we talk about site building, there are a lot of plans available that have very well put together themes. Squarespace and Photo Shelter, Format and Verb and Wix are a few that I would identify. A lot of these have plans available with student discounts that can bring the cost down to less than $100 a year. And they often include domain registration. And yes, I do think you should register your own domain name, because this really reinforces your commitment to your work and your professionalism. There's a lot of overlap in terms of the types of templates or themes and the current trends. They're all relatively easy to edit and maintain and don't require a lot of coding. Some people do use WordPress themes. They're a little bit more of an investment in energy, because they often require a bit of tuning, and they're more demanding in terms of setup, and they also require an internet service provider to host them. But you know, I'm not going to unpack a lot of the different types of themes at this point. A lot of those are personal preferences, but they all work relatively well. And you know, the edit and the structure is something I think you want to think about more in terms of how you put your work together. The next aspect of portfolio that I want to talk about is what we call in the book your online presence. And this encompasses blogs and social media and other online components beyond the portfolio itself. There are a host of online resources that are typically used by photographers that get beyond the portfolio. I'm going to talk a little bit about blogs specifically, because you know, the portfolio is a curated, focused presentation, and blogs allow you to present works that are individual, that don't necessarily fit in the structure of portfolio. And so that question, how does a blog differ? It's not as curated, and there's an opportunity there. You can present works individually, as I said, that don't fit in, show one-offs, behind-the-scenes process, other aspects of your work as a creative. Blogs also extend your visibility, because you can not only maintain connections to the audience that you have, but you can extend your online presence by contributing to it regularly and staying engaged with this audience by updating. And so a blog is something that's going to be less static than a portfolio. And a blog enables you to incorporate a range of work, because it doesn't necessarily have to be as cohesive in terms of the work included, and that content can give us a sense of who you are, your personality as a creative. It's important to always keep it relevant and related to what you do, but you can show a range of things that relate to your production as a photographer and your engagement of the medium in your work. So that being said, there's these questions about what what goes into the content of a blog. As I said, it should be current and active, and you should update a blog at regular intervals, even if it's once a month or even every 2 months. You want to have an active blog. You're trying to show extended content, behind-the-scenes view, production stills, outtakes, things that you couldn't incorporate in a more formal structured portfolio. It's great to highlight new work in print, announce things that you've been involved in, projects, promos, new promos even. Personal work is absolutely a great thing to include in the blog because it gets beyond client work and shows perhaps another range that you have that someone might not see in a more client-directed portfolio. Show things that inspire you. It doesn't always have to be your own work, work that you've been looking at. It's great to include that kind of content. So just a few examples of typical blogs. This is a blog for Chip Litherland, who's a Florida-based photographer. It's a very effective use because it's primarily based on his commission work, and there's some overlap and duplication with his portfolio, but the blog allows him to give a more extended view, and he is able to provide some context to the work he's producing by using short narratives or commentary on his work, as well as some of the one-off shoots that he might do. It really gives us a sense of how he approaches his work and his relationship to the subject, and how his images get realized. So this is a nice way to expand our sense of him as a photographer. A different kind of blog is one used by Evan Kafka, who does editorial advertising work as well as stock. He chose intentionally to use a grid structure for his blog rather than single posting format because he could reach an audience a little more broadly. The idea is that maybe they'll gravitate to a particular work of interest, and if there was a single work up that wasn't relevant to them, he might lose them in terms of their interest in his work. So he really considers this a feeder to his website. This is the work of a blog for still life photographer James Worrell, and he's often used it to have a little bit more expansive dialogue about the work he's doing. In this case, on this blog post, he's featuring a video, and it allows him to talk a bit about the development of ideas and projects. And again, it's a way to expand our sense of him as a creative and his working process. This is the blog of Rena Newman. She's the food photographer we featured earlier, and while it's not visually consistent with the portfolio, it reinforces the brand concept because it's a blog about food, and it's on target in terms of what she does. So this kind of expands our sense of her involvement with food as someone who photographs it. Finally, I wanted to show you something a little bit of an offshoot. This is the Q&A blog of Zach Arias, who's a leading blogger in the photo industry, and he's been developed an area where he's a kind of enthusiastic and energetic educator. This is a unique case where this blog grows into something in and of itself that's unrelated to his client work, but there's a real value in it because it extends visibility. And the one thing about online presence is visibility. So Zach Arias has a lot of visibility as a function of his very active blogging. Blogging platforms can be really pretty straightforward. Tumblr is probably the most simple and direct and easy to use to develop a blog. WordPress, as I mentioned, is a more robust platform for blogging and for portfolio sites, but requires an ISP to host. And a lot of the site building platforms do offer blog templates such as Squarespace, where those are built into the templates that you have. So there's a lot of options for development of a blog. And as with all your materials, you want the blog to be visually consistent with your visual identity and portfolio. You want to continue to do that. And you don't have to be an extensive writer. You can create a visually driven blog that's simply images. It doesn't have to be a complicated project to be effective, as long as you're out there and contributing. I want to shift now to promotional materials. They're a very important part. They've always been for photographers. They reinforce your brand. They get the attention and build audience, and they're part of this multifaceted approach. They can be very simple. These are Marcus Smith, simple postcards. A printed object is still of value, and here you have a series of postcards on the Great American Game. It's high school football. A postcard is still an effective means. Here's a little bit nicer presentation by the photographer Matt Naj. He was working in Oaxaca and working with weavers in Oaxaca and taking portraits, and he creates this lovely little package with a woven piece of material. So there are different ways to present them. Here's a photographer, Matthew Bowie, and it's a series of postcard portraits, and they're presented in a glassine envelope, and it's a really nice and elegant presentation. So a simple postcard can go a long way. A more expansive and kind of promotion materials is from the food photographer Rena Newman, and we include this in the book because we really like it. Here she has a box of caramels that are actually flavored with bacon, I believe, if I remember the recipe. It's wrapped in butcher paper with a butcher's label. So again, the iconography reinforces an idea about the work she does. It's kind of fun and playful, a little bit different thinking, and it shows some creativity on her part to kind of extend the idea of her work with food. Another example is Matt Dutile, who's a travel photographer. He's in our book, and here you have a promo that looks like a ticket, either a train or in this case an airline ticket. It's placed in an envelope with maps, so there's this reinforcement of the idea of him being a travel photographer, and it's really nicely done. A little more out of the box is, and shows a lot of initiative and energy, is a promo by Danny Cohen, which is a pop-up for the holidays. It's playful and creative. It's very well engaging, and it shows a lot of initiative on his part. Taking it one step further, if you want to go even, make an even bigger leap out of the box, here you have a promo. This is from the No Plastic Sleeves blog by Justin Polson, and yes, that is a thumb drive. He apparently wanted to create this promo because he does a lot of prop work, as he describes in the blog, for his photography, and it's often overlooked because it's sort of seamlessly integrated. So he created these silicone cast thumbs. This was apparently wrapped in gauze when it was sent. And it's a really effective and memorable piece, and here's an example of all the thumb drives he produced. So this is taking things fairly far. There's a lot of crafting, but it's a great idea if you can execute it and really will be memorable and get someone's attention. Another idea for a promo piece is to do something that creates a context for work that you might not normally have. So here you have a magazine that's produced by Jeremy Bales, and he basically creates an illustrated, the form of a classic illustrated comic book. And this really highlights his production and narrative skills, and it really enables him to present some abilities that you wouldn't normally do in a single image promo or even a small folded pamphlet. This really is a developed piece that he obviously would spend some time and energy on, and was sent, as my understanding, in a very targeted way. But it's a great way to create a context for work by developing this if you don't have one available in a regular form. Consistent with that is a student promo by a recent BFA graduate in photography named Lisa Check. She photographs a lot of live music and bands. She partnered with some friends who were both designers and writers, and basically created an online magazine that then was available as a printed MagCloud magazine, inexpensively produced and could be ordered on demand. And it created a context for her work because she's new to the business and didn't have a lot of opportunities to be published. It also allowed her to create relationships and connections with musicians and develop a body of work that could be placed in a context where it'd be seen. Finally, this is a really elaborate and beautifully done promo by Jimmy Williams, showcasing musicians who represent traditional Southern music, and there's really wonderful iconography here with respect to classic vinyl records. So this is a highly developed promo, and just to give you an idea of how far things can be taken, and obviously this involves some cost in production. So some of the keys to successful promotion is to really research your audience, do your homework, be targeted with your promotions and outreach. You want to try and create promos regularly and maybe create a schedule for yourself, even if it's twice a year and you do something small. You don't have to start out large scale. You can just do postcards or even e-promos. You want to follow up and stay engaged with your audience, and don't forget your community. Market to your community, your peers, and you'd be surprised how often people get referred by their peers for work. Audience building is not limited to clients, and that's an important thing to bear in mind. Finally, one of the last things I want to talk about is using social media. It really is an essential part of self-promotion these days, and and it's very effective for extending audience and also driving traffic to your site and blog. A classic example is Twitter. It allows you to regularly provide updates and announce anything new that you're doing. You know, one thing I always want to say is make sure you keep your personal and professional social media separate. It's important to keep those things apart and be focused. But you can drive people to your site and drive people to your blog by keeping them updated. Facebook is another useful tool in that regard. One of the disadvantages of social media is that it's generic and it's harder to incorporate your visual identity because you can't really inform these sites to the same degree that your online portfolio and blog can, but it's very effective for outreach and bringing people and building audience, but bringing people to your work. I wanted to talk a little bit about Instagram as a separate platform because it's unique. It's both a social media platform and an image sharing platform. In many cases, it becomes a real focal point for someone's business as a photographer because they get hired through their Instagram work and they're asked to produce work for the Instagram platform because of its visibility. A lot of photographers use it to raise their own visibility and drive traffic to their portfolio or online blog site. With Instagram, you want to just be thoughtful about keeping the content relevant. This is an example of Jimmy Williams. He's in our book. And as I said, think about curating what you do just as you would with your portfolio site, making it relevant to your work, and maybe taking advantage of the singular image presentation to show images that you might not normally present in your portfolio. A lot of photographers are found through Instagram. And use it to drive traffic to their sites and get work. So it is a very significant and powerful tool, and it could be a whole discussion in and of itself. So finally, I just want to talk a little bit about putting this all together. You have a lot of moving parts here, and when we talk about these things, your promos, as I say here, can help you connect to your audience and enable you to target specific clients. Your online portfolio should be a structured presentation of key bodies of work that you should update biannually, if not quarterly. Social media helps you build audience and drive traffic to your site and blog, and your blog can serve to provide a more expansive and varied content to inform your audience about your work and what you're doing and your interests as a creative. The goal is to get your work seen and for you to be seen as an active creative in the field. And you can leverage all these elements in concert. You know, the portfolio book, which we really started with, is the closer here. But you actually have to be working on these all at the same time. That being said, don't get overwhelmed. You can start out small, build a portfolio, create an online portfolio, develop a promo. Maybe then you follow up with a blog. You don't have to do it all at once, but the idea is to build on these pieces, and once you have them in place, the challenge is to keep them all going, and that's probably a larger discussion. So I will close at this point and open things up to questions. Sorry, we just lost our screen. I'll go back to my initial page, but I thank you all for your time tonight, and I think we're going to go to Q&A now.
Larry, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. And I'm going to have Melanie Fander present some of our student questions. We're going to start out with one of our student ambassadors, actually, Jessie James. She's one of our student mentors and kind of helps new students as they're getting into the program. But I also wanted to mention a few of you have asked about recording for this or a copy of it. We are going to have this available on our YouTube channel, and you can access that through the PSPN community. All right, Melanie, what have you got for us?
Well, the first question that came in is from Tina Brooks, and she says, Google has stepped out of the box and changed the ideas of their branding while keeping it similar. Is it possible for a photographer to take on that same concept? And she goes on to say that her logo is unique, and she's wondering about changing the color or adding specific elements to match the overall branding. So, in other words, to kind of sum that up, if a big corporation such as Google can kind of step outside the box, so to speak, while keeping their branding consistent, how would a photographer go about that?
That's an interesting and complex question. I mean, I think there's always core elements to the brand identity, and I think based on the question, that this person has that. I think the idea is to maybe change the context for how the brand is seen, and that can be through maybe pushing the envelope a little bit and varying things in terms of how with the types of promotional materials you make, or bringing the brand into to be seen in the context of maybe work that alters a sense of the brand in terms of a different body of work. So, photographers evolve over time, so you may have sort of a brand identity or a visual identity that you've been using, and it has some fairly direct relationship to the type of work you've been typically producing. You can start to shift in terms of the type of work you do, and I, in fact, would encourage one to do that and bring other work into the context of your already established brand, if that makes sense. As a way to start to move things into a different direction. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, definitely, definitely. And in fact, that kind of brings me to my next question from Angela Parsons, just continuing on with that theme of branding. She goes on to say, any recommendations on how to find your brand as you're starting out? She says that her brand seems to change a little bit, but from what you've been saying, perhaps that's normal in the beginning.
Yeah, I think it's a really, brand is a large and complicated topic, and particularly when you're a young photographer, often the students in our program, I would say, have often sort of general bodies of work, and they haven't yet developed their own visual style, let alone a sense of a brand identity as a function of that style or as an outgrowth of that style. So I think that's something that you want to give yourself some time with. That being said, it can be useful and helpful to work on a consistent visual approach or visual identity, where you might be using a specific set of elements within the context of your portfolio and your online site and maybe even a business card, so you look polished and professional, and as that evolves, you can start to change that. There are certainly photographers who've rebranded. I have, and that's something that can happen every few years or every 5 to 10 years, depending on how long you're in the business. So consistency with what you have initially now is a good thing. Taking a look at where you are in a year or so and saying, well, maybe I can kind of ramp it up or get some help with developing a brand is something that you can expect to do, down the road a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. And one of our students, Scott Mullins, is actually also discussing that same issue of rebranding, but he's a little worried about changing, the type of photography. So in other words, if he's adjusting his subgenre of interest, so to speak, will that essentially adjust his branding?
Well, that kind of crosses over into another area, which is,
Mm,
what's the market you're working in, and
right.
that's we're actually, I think, now talking about less an issue of brand per se as much as a client base. So if he's starting to develop a body of work that moves away from his initial sort of client work, he's expanding and kind of reaching into another market. It may be that he creates a subset and creates a targeted set of materials for that. If it is so unrelated, so I know people who do wedding and retail sort of photography, and yet they also do work in editorial and corporate. And at a certain point, those things may have to be separated. But there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's a good thing to do. But you may have to make a decision that you're actually starting to develop a different body of work, and you may want to actually present that with a very separate portfolio or presentation and brand.
Mm. I'm glad you mentioned the wedding photography as a subgenre, just to kind of touch on. We had a question from Jennifer Kimay, and excuse me, Jennifer, if I pronounced your last name wrong. Um, it seems today that there's a specific trend going on in wedding photography, particularly in editing style, where it seems a little airy-fairy, highlights are a little overexposed, but it's certainly working for the industry. It's like boomed, this whole trend. So,
Right.
would you say that branding can sometimes follow fads or trends, and is it best to avoid them or embrace them?
Well, I think that that's an interesting problem. And my personal opinion is don't be afraid to step outside the norm and differentiate yourself. There will be a risk that you may lose some of your audience because they're going to be looking for that familiar thing that they see everybody else has. But on the other hand, if it's relevant to you, in the long run, you're better served because you're going to attract the kinds of clients that you want to work with as opposed to maybe doing the work you don't want to do. So I'm sort of taking this one step further. I have a former student who basically is in wedding photography, and for a long time she also worked on a farm. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that she started doing a lot of rural sort of farm location weddings, mm-hmm. and she realized that she was combining two areas of her interest, and she'd often kept them separate. And so now she's sort of repackaging herself as that sort of rural kind of photographer that does these kind of rustic weddings. Right. And she may risk losing the more formal, traditional ballroom wedding client, but in the end, it's where she wants to be, and she also is the kind of client she wants to attract. So one of the things about that is that you really want to be sure you're authentic to yourself, and it's important sometimes to take those risks.
Right, right. So for those students who are starting out, I think one of the biggest challenges that I face in the portfolio courses is, they may have played around with a logo or a certain text or something. We're not all great at drawing or designing. For those who are starting to create their logo, what would be your suggestion for an approach to step into that?
Well, sometimes, the simplest thing is the best, which is create a very straightforward typographic treatment, because a logo is really a symbolic form, and it's a complicated thing to develop. So sometimes a clean typographic approach to their name or the name of their business is often a better way to start. And then around that, for example, that's when we talk about cover design, you can build a dynamic cover design around an image. So let the skill set that you have sort of drive that, if that makes any sense. If you reach a point where you really want to develop a logo, this is often where I draw on my community, and I call on people who have maybe better skills sets than I do. There's no shame in that, and I think sometimes I've made some feeble attempts at creating some design for myself, and then what I'll do is really call on a friend to at least help me and advise me. But I think a simple type treatment that is consistent and clean is often a better way to go than to really try to push a logo design yourself, and then have the context drive that presentation with the work that you do have a good skill base, which is your imagery, if that makes some sense.
Oh, definitely. When one is just starting to build their portfolio, how do you make the decision on which photograph should be placed into the portfolio, or which one should be left out?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to look at the imagery and try and establish, what are the themes, or what is the photographic type of photographic work you're doing, and see if there's a consistency in a set of images. One of the things that can happen when you first start to edit is that you realize you need more imagery, and right. Actually that's a good problem to have, because now you're starting to actually clarify what your body of work should be. And I know plenty of photographers who produce images for simply for the sake of portfolio building. So you want consistency, and you want those images to be sort of directly related to either subject matter, theme, or approach that you're trying to build out. And if you don't have enough imagery, I would say this is when you try to start to build that portfolio. The challenge when you're just starting out is that you may have a lot of small groupings of work and not a larger body. but it's very helpful to at least establish that fact so you can start to build out some of those areas that are most relevant to you in terms of the work you want to do. You may have to make an initial portfolio that shows a kind of general sampling, and as a student there's nothing wrong with that, but as you're doing that you can already start to be thinking ahead, well, where do I want to build this out and how can I generate those images?
Yes, we had a student, and I'm sure many of the students in here are in a similar situation. Jessie James, that was her question. You know, they're all in the beginning of building their portfolios. And for many of our classes, at the end of a course, students are asked to put together, you know, a body of work that they've created within that class. And in the portfolio classes, it is a little bit more intense. And as you noted, I do try to tell my students, you know, if you want to shoot new work, if you feel like what you have shot in the past isn't up to par, or perhaps you feel you can do better, to just continue to shoot more in that same subgenre.
Yeah, I often, in my final projects in all my classes, I ask my students, well, if you had 3 more weeks, what would you do with this project?
Hmm.
And I strongly encourage students to take projects and extend them outside of class. That's how you build portfolio. And some of the strongest portfolios I've seen of my students are the ones who just took it upon themselves to shoot over the summer. You know,
Right.
to give them, or to either extend an idea or to give themselves a project. That is how photographers build portfolio. You know, and it's great when you start to build it out of commissioned work and client work, but initially you really got to keep shooting, and I strongly encourage you to do that.
Yeah.
Um, and do side projects. You never know what evolves out of that. Side projects can grow into great portfolio pieces.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
And you know, my first freelance editorial and commercial portfolio was all built out of side project work, and in fact, it was all made with Polaroids that I've
Hmm.
been shooting on the side just as a one-off. And suddenly I realized I had a body of work that was different. So you never
Yeah.
know where it comes from.
Yeah. Now, when you start to put your portfolios online, this is a question that comes from Miguel Cruz. Is there any way to protect your photographic work once it's out there and published on the internet?
It's difficult. Certainly, there's watermarking. And beyond watermarking, there's actually running your name literally, you know, across part of the image. You can also set up sites where you can't one-click, you know, copy the photograph and download it and save it. And there's also metadata. But at a certain point, your work can be taken and used. And this is a large issue. And I think the thing I would tell you is that for you right now, visibility is more important, I think, than protecting your copyright, in that the individuals who will generally steal your images are probably not generating a lot of revenue. And I don't want to be so cynical or devalue your work, but I actually think that it's more important for you to get your work out there. Where
Yeah.
copyright infringement becomes significant is when it's a major player that's actually, you know, benefiting greatly because there's some profit. Usually our images get taken and used in ways that don't really generate much revenue, so there really isn't a loss to us other than, you know, it's personally an affront to have someone steal your work and use it. But I think it's better to put it out there, and certainly, so you can lock down the images so they can't be copied. You can watermark them. You can rely on metadata. You certainly should embed metadata so your work can be traced if it ever gets used in a way that actually could be a significant loss to you. But I would say put it up, get it out there.
Yeah. And in terms of putting your work, you know, out there in the wide worlds of the interwebs, between the images that you put on the blog versus the images that you put on your online portfolio, would you say it's okay to duplicate those, or would you prefer that uh, or would you suggest, I should say, that you know you share some images specifically on your blog and some images specifically on your portfolio?
Well, I think it's perfectly fine to have images show up on your blog that are either being put into your portfolio or added to your portfolio, because you know you may get a job or a commission, and you produce a great image that gets published, and so you might want to show the tear sheet, or you might want to just show the image that you produce for that client. And then that image, so initially it gets announced on the blog, which is kind of the news and the way to kind of ping your audience about what you're up to and say, here's what's going on. And then if it's a strong image, it absolutely should end up on your site as part of your more sort of static online portfolio. So that overlap is fine. Sometimes you may have work that often shows up on the blog that may not be appropriate for your more focused body of work on your online portfolio, and there might not be as much duplication, but it's perfectly fine if initially things show up on the blog and then end up in the portfolio, or if you put a new body of work up on the portfolio and you want to kind of talk about that. I think it's a great way to drive interest to go look at the entire body of work if part of it's on the blog.
Right, right. Yes, that's very true. That was actually a question from Stacy Williams, and similarly, and I'm going to end with this question from Diana Parrott. Uh, we're talking about this, whether to put images on the blog or on a portfolio, using the blog as a way to introduce a body of work. For those students in here who are interested in both commercial photography, maybe specifically portrait photography, and those who are also interested in fine art, would you suggest that somebody have, say, more than one website, or one website to group everything together?
That's a really great question, and it's a real challenge because I'm someone who's sort of had my feet in both worlds, and a lot of photographers do. If you develop enough of a distinct body of work, say personal projects as a fine artist, you may very well want that to reside on a separate site. So it's a discrete presentation that features that work in a very particular way. However, I would say that if you had a more commercially oriented site, you could link out to that so people could see those fine art projects. Those things can reside on the same site, but there is a point where maybe who they understand you are, if it's particularly if you're trying to target clients, might get a little bit diluted, and so I think the risk of combining them or having them live on the same site is it can get kind of muddying of sort of the message about you. Linking out, though, I think creates a discrete separation, and I think that can be more useful and more fruitful from my point of view, because they're just really two different voices. But you certainly can find overlap maybe in sort of blogging about fine art work that you're doing, or announcing to commercial clients that you're having a show. I think personal projects are really important. But if it's really a large, a body of work that you're developing, it's good if it exists on a separate site, so one site doesn't become this sort of combination of voices, which could at some point maybe undermine how someone understands who you are and what you do. But being able to link out, or being able to find out that you're doing some other things and that you're showing perhaps in a gallery setting or something like that eventually, that's a nice thing as a supplement and as a way to kind of extend someone's perception of you as a creative, but maybe just keep the work separate.
I think that's a good idea. Well, we're certainly getting a lot of thank yous in the chat box. One student in particular saying this has been the most beneficial webinar she's ever attended.
Well, I'm really pleased. I have to admit, I tried to cover a lot of bases, and I hope I didn't go too quickly. But I do recommend, just before we end, take a look at Danielle Currier's No Plastic Sleeves blog. There's great resources there. I think our book can be really helpful and useful. It goes into more depth. And there's a lot of great information, by the way, in other places like PhotoShelter. PhotoShelter has a blog that is filled with information about the business. Highly recommended. I recommend to my students. So that's the beauty of online. But thank you very much. It's been really a pleasure to talk with everyone tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Larry. It's been great having you here. And guys, remember, you can continue this conversation with your peers and professors over at our Google Plus Photography Student Professional Network. I've posted that link for you. And thanks to everybody that posted great questions. And
yeah, great questions.
yeah, this has been terrific. Thank you so much, Larry. And Melanie, thank you for handling the questions as well.
No
And
problem.
we've got more stuff coming up for you in the coming weeks here, more live presentations. And also tomorrow, don't forget Photo Live, Get Critiqued is happening. We are featuring narrative photography on that. And we'll see you at 12 p.m. Eastern Time for Photo Live, Get Critiqued. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a good
you.
night.
Good night.